Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and today on the history of Cottingham Snickets we're going to be taking a look at Bacongarth Lane, a snicket that has intimate ties with Cottingham's two priories, which are actually just one priory. It will all become clear, trust me. So today there's not much left of Bacongarth Lane. Most people in Cottingham will know it as a snicket that's fairly straight and short and cuts through between South Street and the Garth, a later housing development. But in actual fact, this is just the northern end, a remnant of a much older and much longer path that went all the way down and connected Cottingham to Haltemprice Priory, almost all the way in Willoughby. In fact, if you come to the end of Bacongarth and you walk around the road, the Garth, you come to a small cul-de-sac called Abbott's Walk. And at the end of Abbott's Walk is the rest of this path all the way down to Haltemprice. So here we are at the end of Abbott's Walk, and this is the beginning of the walk down towards Haltemprice Priory. I was going to walk this, but I'm not going to lie to you, that's a bog. So instead, I'm going to walk it using the magic of video editing. Cue the walking montage. Well, that looked fairly legit, didn't it? Anyway, before we discuss the history of this priory, maybe it's a good point to figure out what a priory is anyway, just in case you don't already know.
So what is a priory? Well, the simple answer is it's a kind of monastery, a level down from an abbey and about the same level as a friary. Where an abbey is run by an abbot, a priory is, as you might expect, run by a prior, who's usually subservient to an abbot. There were several different orders of monks in the East Riding during the Middle Ages, all of whom had slightly different ways and manners. There were the Carmelites, for instance, or White Friars, so named because of the white robes they wore, who gave us the names of the street Whitefriars in Hull city centre. The land Trinity House now stands on used to be a Carmelite friary. Then there were the Dominicans, or Black Friars, again because of the robes they wore, but confusingly, they had nothing to do with the Hull Street Blackfriar Gate. That was named after an order of Augustinian monks who had a monastery near the marketplace, and who also wore black robes. But they were generally known as Black Canons, so really it should have been Black Canon Gate. Then there were the Carthusians, who built the original almshouse and hospital that preceded the present almshouse on Charterhouse Lane. And then there were the Cistercians, who, just to really confuse the whole White Friar Black Canon thing, were also known as the White Monks because of their white robes, and they lived in Mews Abbey.
So the monks who built this priory were Augustinians, the Black Canons, not the Black Friars. We've already discussed this. It's very confusing. But they were gifted land in Cottingham by a man called Thomas Wake, who was actually one of the lords, a baron in fact, who sided with Queen Isabella against her then husband Edward II in a successful coup that put the young infant Edward III on the throne of England. But that's a completely different story. So the monks came here to build their priory. But actually, when I say here, but when the monks first came, they came here to Northgate, actually in Cottingham itself, to specifically a site just to the west of the railway lines, although obviously the railway lines weren't there at that point, they came later. And they had quite a substantial building. It was built just over here behind these houses and partly in the gardens of what are now the houses on the south side of Northgate. And whilst they were only here for a few years, they left some fairly substantial buildings, a church and a moat we know for certain because they're mentioned in a papal bull in 1325. But the monks discovered something in the fine print of their contract for the land that gave them some pause for thought. Basically, because of a law or an old charter or something to do with Cottingham itself, the lord of the land or his descendants could at any time take that land away from them, thus destroying their priory. And this wouldn't do. So they sought some papal permission to up sticks and move, which they received, and they then moved lock, stock and barrel all the way down to the small hamlet of Newton, which of course we now know as Haltemprice. But the remains that were left here were actually fairly substantial. We know this because they're still noted down on the Ordnance Survey maps as being a moat and a site of an Augustinian priory. Gradually, all of that was buried underneath the development of Northgate itself and, of course, later the development of Canongate to the south. But bearing in mind that the abbey was only here for 4 years, it's very unlikely you're going to see ghosts of monks hanging around in your back garden if you live around here. I think probably the worst they would have faced would be a bit of food poisoning. I'm not sure anybody needs a ghost of that. So this would have been the hamlet of Newton. When the priory was built, the community was incorporated into it and it was all renamed Haltemprice, which is a name the whole area bears to this day. And it was one of the later monasteries to be built within Yorkshire, so most of the bigger earlier ones like Mews for instance had already taken the lion's share of the land and the power. But that's not to say this priory didn't have some land and power. It was granted the manors of Willoughby for instance, as well as the churches at Cottingham, Kirkella and weirdly Warren Percy, which is all the way out near Wetwang. But like Mews out to the east, this priory suffered from having a succession of very poor leaders who weren't really very good at making the money from the lands that they had. In 1367, the Archbishop of York had to send an investigator here to get to the bottom of the financial irregularities. I'm sure the money was just resting in their accounts. In 1411, another team of investigators arrived, only to find something even weirder. The bell tower had collapsed and crushed several buildings. The gatehouse and several other buildings had burnt down, and some of the other buildings had no roofs or doors. But there were still monks living here in the few dwellings that were still intact, and it definitely hadn't been let to students. But things were getting even worse for the priory, because in 1440, the city of Hull was awarded a charter that turned it into a county, and the land of that county extended right over here, right to the land that Haltemprice Priory was stood on. And this presaged decades of legal and political wrangling between the priory and the sheriff of Hull that culminated in 1515 in a massive punch-up between 200 Hull people and the monks and their farm labourers. Quite mad. But like all of the monasteries, it came to an end in the 16th century when King Henry VIII had his major temper tantrum against the Catholic Church and decided he was going to have all the monasteries for himself and he was going to be the leader of his own church. The monastery was dissolved, the stones broken apart, and built into this, which dates from the 16th century, this old farmhouse behind me, which is now being renovated after decades of standing empty and toothless, which is rather nice to see. But it incorporates quite a lot of the original stones from the priory, and is itself quite a historic building.
And so Bacongarth Lane for almost 200 years was used by monks and lay people to travel between Haltemprice Priory and Cottingham. And the reasons for doing this would have been many and varied. The monks, for instance, would have wanted to go backwards and forwards for trading purposes, or for collecting food or rent money. And don't forget, they owned the Church of Cottingham, so lay people would have often come to the priory simply to discuss church parish matters. And even after the dissolution of the monastery, this still would have been the most direct link between Cottingham and Willoughby for 500 years.
But not everybody who went down Bacongarth Lane headed to the priory. Right at the end here, it hooked sharply to the west, and at the end of that spur in the 19th century were a couple of big houses, Southwood House and Brooklands. Now, those were sadly demolished as part of the urban development of the area. In fact, when you think about it, Bacongarth probably has lost more than any of the other Snickets that we've covered. It lost its priory 500 years ago, though it still persisted as a way through towards Willoughby. But then, in the housing developments of the 50s and 60s, it lost its great houses as well, and a great deal of its length, leaving just this short, straight snippet that goes between South Street and the Garth, walked every day by school children on the way to Bacongarth Primary School, who never realised just how important this used to be, or how old it is. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this, and you'll be tuning in for the next episode, which will be on Snuffmill Lane, which I know technically isn't a Snicket, but it's my channel. I think it's a Snicket. It's snickety. There's a bit of Snicket in it. It's fine. It's fine. Until next time.